In the dusty streets of Red Hollow, New Mexico, justice came at the end of a whip. Clara Reyes never imagined that feeding hungry miners would cost her everything she held dear. The town boss wanted to make an example of the quiet Mexican seamstress, ordering a public flogging that would scar more than just her back. As the leather cracked against her thin dress and the crowd looked away in shame, one man refused to turn his head. Jonah Pike, a silent cowboy whose voice had been stolen by a Comanche arrow, watched every brutal stroke with eyes cold as winter steel. When the punishment ended and the townsfolk scattered like tumbleweeds, Jonah did something that shocked everyone. He lifted Clara's broken body into his arms, carried her to the doctor, and paid her debts with his own hard-earned silver. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, word spread through Red Hollow. Like wildfire, the voiceless drifter had bought a wedding ring and filed papers with the circuit judge. What could drive a man who barely knew her to marry a woman the entire town had just humiliated? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver veins that ran beneath Red Hollow had birthed the town just as surely as a mother births her child, with blood, sweat, and considerable pain. What started as a handful of prospectors' tents in 1878 had swollen into a proper settlement of near 3,000 souls, all drawn by the promise of fortune glittering in the mountain's belly. Adobe buildings lined the main street like weathered sentinels, their flat roofs catching the endless New Mexico sun that baked the earth hard. As pottery dot, but for all its growth, Red Hollow remained a company town in every sense that mattered. The Consolidated Mining Company owned the mountain, the mines, the smelter, and the sprawling company store that sat at the heart of town like a spider in its web. What the company didn't own outright, it controlled through debt, fear, or simple necessity. A man needed work. He worked for the company. He needed supplies. He bought from the company store. He stepped out of line. He answered to company enforcers who wore badges but served only one master. Clara Elena Reyes had lived in Red Hollow for 3 years, long enough to understand its rhythms and respect its dangers. Her small adobe house sat on Esperanza Street, where the Mexican families clustered together like gathered wildflowers, finding strength in shared heritage and quiet solidarity. The house had belonged to an old woman who died without family, and Clara had paid the back taxes with money saved from her seamstress work. It wasn't much 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a courtyard barely large enough for her herb garden, but it was hers. Each morning, Clara would wake before dawn and tend her plants by lamplight, rosemary for remembrance, sage for wisdom, mint for healing, the same herbs her grandmother had grown in the mountains of Sonora before the family had drifted north following rumor of work and hope. She'd inherited more than recipes and remedies from her abuela. She'd received a leather sewing kit that had crossed 3 borders and survived 2 decades of wandering. The worn pouch contained needles that never seemed to dull, thread in colors that matched any fabric, and a silver thimble engraved with tiny roses that caught the light like captured stars. Clara's skill with needle and thread had earned her a modest reputation among the miners' wives. She could take a torn work shirt and make it look nearly new, transform a faded dress into something suitable for Sunday church, or craft a child's school clothes from flour sacks and ingenuity. Her fingers moved with the confidence of long practice, each stitch placed with the care of someone who understood that in a hard world, small beauties mattered enormously. The miners paid what they could when they could. Sometimes it was silver coins that caught the afternoon light. More often, it was trade a sack of beans, a side of bacon, a pair of sturdy boots worn only at the heels. Clara never turned anyone away, understanding that pride was sometimes the heaviest burden a person could carry. She'd learned to read the signs, The way a woman's eyes would dart to her children when discussing payment, the hesitation in a man's voice when he brought a torn jacket but couldn't afford proper repair. In those moments, Clara would discover a small tear in her own dress that needed mending, or remember that she'd been meaning to practice a new stitch pattern, or simply decide that payment could wait until the next payday. This quiet charity had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, had remarked more than once that Clara was too soft for her own good. The comment always carried the weight of warning, the suggestion that kindness was a luxury the working class couldn't afford. But Clara had learned her values from watching her grandmother treat every person who came to their door with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay for remedies. Some lessons, she believed, were worth the cost. On the outskirts of town, where the desert began to reclaim the land from human ambition, Jonah Pike maintained his own quiet existence. His ranch was modest by any measure, a small cabin with a stone fireplace, a barn that housed his 4 horses, and enough acreage to graze them properly. He'd bought the land 3 years back with savings from his cattle-driving days, when he'd spent months on dusty trails moving herds from Texas to railroad towns farther north. The arrow that had stolen his voice had also ended his career on the cattle drives. Not because he couldn't do the work. Jonah remained as capable with horses and rope as any man in the territory, but because trail bosses needed men who could shout orders, rally scattered cattle, and communicate across vast distances. A silent cowboy, however skilled, was a liability when the herd stampeded or storms scattered the animals across miles of open country. Jonah had adapted to his limitation with the same steady patience he brought to everything else. He'd learned to communicate with gestures, written notes, and the subtle art of reading what others needed before they asked. His horses responded to his touch better than most animals answered to shouted commands. When he needed supplies in town, he prepared his list carefully, wrote out his questions in advance, and conducted his business with quiet efficiency. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his presence without really knowing him. They called him polite, reliable, and kept to himself, the sort of man who paid his bills on time and never caused trouble. Some of the unmarried women had tried to catch his interest with smiles and conversation, but Jonah's responses remained courteous and distant. Most folks figured him for a confirmed bachelor, the kind of man who preferred the company of horses to people. What they didn't know was that Jonah Pike possessed a careful observer's eye and a memory that recorded injustice with the precision of a ledger book. He saw which families struggled to pay their company store bills. He noticed when children came to school wearing clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric disappeared beneath patches. He watched the resignation in men's faces when they collected their pay envelopes and calculated how little would be left after the company deducted rent, store credit, and mysterious fees that seemed to multiply like weeds. The Consolidated Mining Company operated under the ruthless efficiency of men who had never worked a day underground. Burton Hayes, the local company boss, had arrived from Denver with a reputation for increasing profits and decreasing costs. He was a sharp-featured man in his 50s, who wore expensive suits and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Under his management, the company store had raised prices while reducing credit terms. Work shifts had grown longer, while safety measures had been quietly reduced. Men who complained found themselves assigned to most dangerous sections of the mine, or simply discovered that their services were no longer required. Dr. Fernando Martinez represented one of the few voices of independence in Red Hollow. The elderly physician had established his practice before the mining company had gained its stranglehold on the town, and his reputation for skill and discretion had made him indispensable to company executives and common miners alike. He treated Burton Hayes' gout with the same professional care he brought to setting a miner's broken bones, and his medical neutrality had earned him a grudging respect that bordered on immunity. The doctor's clinic occupied a converted adobe house on the main street, its rooms filled with the clean scent of carbolic acid and the quiet authority of a man who had seen every variety of human suffering. He spoke Spanish as fluently as English, and his patients trusted him with secrets they would never share with company men. Dr. Martinez understood that in a town like Red Hollow, healing involved more than treating physical ailments. Sometimes, the most important medicine was simply listening to someone's fears without judgment. Father Miguel Sandoval presided over the small Catholic church that served the Mexican families and any others who sought spiritual comfort. The priest was a young man with an old soul, having grown up in poverty himself before answering what he believed was God's call to serve others. His sermons carefully avoided direct political statements, but his actions spoke clearly enough. He shared the church's food stores with hungry families, provided shelter for travelers, and offered counsel to anyone who needed guidance. The mining company tolerated his activities because removing a priest would create more problems than it solved. But Father Sandoval understood that his position was precarious. These were the currents that flowed beneath Red Hollow's surface, the quiet struggles of working families, the careful calculations of men and women trying to maintain dignity in the face of economic servitude, and the growing tension between those who profited from the system and those who suffered under it. Clara Reyes had navigated these waters carefully, offering help where she could, while avoiding direct confrontation with the company's authority. But careful navigation only worked as long as the currents remained predictable on that scorching July morning when the company store's ledger showed discrepancies in inventory, and someone needed to be held accountable for the missing supplies. Clara's quiet acts of charity suddenly became acts of theft in the eyes of men who confused profit with justice. The leather sewing kit that had traveled so far and survived so much would soon witness its owner's greatest trial. But it would also bear witness to an act of unexpected courage from a man who had learned that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones never spoken aloud. The trouble began with a discrepancy in Burton Hayes' ledger, a thick leather-bound book that documented every transaction debt and infraction in Red Hollow with the methodical precision of a man who believed that human worth could be measured in dollars and cents. The company ledger was Hayes' Bible, its pages filled with his cramped handwriting recording who owed what to whom, and more importantly, who could be made to pay when payments fell short. On the morning of July 15, 1885, Hayes discovered that $37 worth of provisions had vanished from his store's inventory without corresponding payment. Flour, beans, coffee, and salt pork basic supplies that kept working families alive between paydays. In a town where a miner's daily wage barely covered a family's basic needs, $37 represented nearly 2 weeks of work. It was the kind of theft that could not be ignored, especially when Hayes suspected it wasn't really theft at all, but something far more dangerous to his authority: charity. The investigation took less than an hour. Hayes questioned his store clerks with the systematic approach of a man conducting an interrogation rather than seeking information. Young Tommy Martinez, Dr. Martinez's nephew, who worked part-time stocking shelves, cracked under pressure when Hayes threatened to have him arrested for conspiracy. The boy's stammered confession painted a picture that confirmed Hayes' worst suspicions. Clara Reyes had been coming to the store regularly, making small purchases for families whose credit had been suspended. She paid with her own money, silver, coins earned from her seamstress work, but instructed Tommy to deliver the supplies directly to the families in need. To Tommy's 19-year-old mind, it seemed like simple kindness. To Hayes, it represented a fundamental challenge to the company store's control over the town's economic life. If word spread that someone was circumventing the credit system, other workers might get ideas about mutual aid and collective action. They might remember that before the mining company's arrival, people had survived through cooperation and shared resources. They might start thinking that their labor had value beyond what the company was willing to pay. Such thoughts Hayes understood, were more dangerous than dynamite in the wrong hands. By 10 o'clock that morning, Hayes had issued orders to his 2 enforcers men, who wore deputy badges but answered only to company authority. They were to arrest Clara Reyes on charges of theft and make the arrest as public as possible. The charge was legally questionable, since Clara had paid for the supplies with her own money, but Hayes cared more about the message than the law. In a company town, the distinction between the two often disappeared anyway. Clara was hanging laundry in her small courtyard when they came for her. The morning sun had already heated the adobe walls, and she was enjoying the simple pleasure of work done in her own space, surrounded by herbs that scented the air with memory and hope. The knock on her door carried an authority that immediately set her on guard. Clara Reyes. The taller enforcer consulted a piece of paper as if he needed confirmation, though everyone in Red Hollow knew the quiet seamstress by sight. "See," she answered, switching to English when she saw their expressions harden. "Yes, I am Clara Reyes. You're under arrest for theft from the company store. Come with us." The words hit her like a physical blow. Theft? I have stolen nothing. There must be some mistake. No mistake. You've been buying supplies under false pretenses and distributing them to families without authorization. That's theft of company property. Clara's mind raced through the implications. The families she'd helped, the Herrera children who'd been going to bed hungry, old Mrs. Valdez whose husband had been injured in a mine collapse, the young Morales couple whose baby needed milk, they would all suffer if this became public. Worse, they might face punishment themselves for accepting help. "I paid for everything," she said carefully. "I have receipts." The supplies went to families whose credit was suspended. That makes you an accessory to theft of services. Now come along quietly, or we'll add resisting arrest to the charges. The walk to the town square felt like the longest journey of Clara's life. Word of her arrest spread through the Mexican quarter with the speed of wildfire, and by the time they reached the whipping post, a crowd had gathered. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed the hard satisfaction of people who believed that troublemakers got what they deserved. Burton Hayes stood beside the weathered wooden post that had been installed when Red Hollow was nothing more than a mining camp. The post bore the scars of previous punishments, grooves worn by rope, stains that spoke of other people's pain, initials carved by bored guards. It stood as a reminder that in this place justice came swift and public, designed more to terrify witnesses than to rehabilitate offenders. "Clara Reyes," Hayes announced in a voice that carried across the square, "you stand accused of theft and conspiracy to defraud the Consolidated Mining Company. The evidence against you is clear and undeniable. Do you wish to name your accomplices, or shall we assume you acted alone?" Clara lifted her chin, feeling the weight of the crowd's attention like a physical force. She thought of the families she'd helped, of children who would go hungry if their fathers lost their jobs for accepting charity. "I acted alone," she said clearly, "and I stole nothing. I paid for supplies with my own money, money earned by providing services to thieves and debtors," Hayes replied. "Money that should have been used to pay down legitimate debts to this company. Your actions have cost us not only direct losses, but the destruction of proper business relationships. 20 lashes will serve as a reminder to this community that charity begins with honest payment of one's obligations." The sentence drew gasps from the crowd. 20 lashes could cripple a person, leave permanent scars, or worse. It was a punishment reserved for the most serious offenses, not for a woman whose only crime was feeding hungry children. "Please," Dr. Martinez stepped forward from the crowd. "Senator Hayes, surely a fine would be more appropriate. Miss Reyes is not a violent criminal." "Dr. Martinez," Hayes replied with cold formality, "I appreciate your concern, but this matter requires decisive action. Miss Reyes has undermined the economic stability of our community. That cannot be tolerated. They tied Clara's hands to the post with rope that bit into her wrists like accusations. Someone had brought out a leather whip, not the heavy bullwhip used on cattle, but a lighter instrument designed for human flesh. The distinction offered little comfort. Clara pressed her face against the worn wood of the post and tried to find strength in prayer, in the memory of her grandmother's courage, in anything that might help her endure what was coming. The first lash struck her back like liquid fire. The thin cotton of her dress provided no protection against the leather's bite. Clara bit her lip to stifle a cry, tasting blood and determination in equal measure. The second lash crossed the first, and she felt warm wetness seeping through. The fabric dot in the crowd, most people looked away. Some crossed themselves. A few women wept openly. Children were hurried away by parents who didn't want them to witness such brutality. But one man never moved, never looked away, never allowed his gaze to waver from Clara's ordeal. Jonah Pike stood at the edge of the crowd with the stillness of carved stone. His gray eyes, cold as mountain lakes in winter, never left Clara's trembling form. His hands remained at his sides, but those who noticed him saw something in his posture that spoke of barely contained violence. He watched every stroke of the whip, witnessed every flinch of pain, recorded every detail of this injustice with the precision of a man who would not forget. By the 10th lash, Clara's dress was torn and bloody. By the 15th, she was fighting to remain conscious. The 20th and final stroke brought a collective exhale from the crowd, as if they'd all been holding their breath throughout the ordeal. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can circumvent proper business procedures, Hayes announced. Justice in Red Hollow is swift and certain. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves and avoiding eye contact with the still-bound woman, Jonah Pike stepped forward. His movement was deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of absolute purpose. He walked past Hayes without acknowledgement, past the enforcers who tensed but didn't interfere, straight to the whipping post. With gentle hands that seemed impossibly tender after what Clara had endured, Jonah untied the ropes that bound her wrists. When her knees buckled, he caught her, lifting her into his arms with the same care he would show a wounded bird. Clara's head fell against his shoulder, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jonah carried Clara toward Dr. Martinez's clinic. His face showed no expression, but his stride spoke of implacable determination. Behind them, Burton Hayes stood beside the blood-stained whipping post, already calculating how this unexpected development might affect his authority. At the clinic, Dr. Martinez was already preparing his supplies when Jonah shouldered through the door. The physician took one look at Clara's condition and directed Jonah to the examination room. As they worked together, the doctor with professional skill, Jonah with surprising gentleness, to clean and treat Clara's wounds, neither man spoke. But in the quiet efficiency of their cooperation, a understanding passed between them. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the afternoon. When she was aware, she found herself wondering why this silent stranger had intervened. When fever took her into dreams, she saw gray eyes that promised something she'd never dared hope for: protection without price, kindness without conditions. As evening shadows lengthened across Red Hollow, Jonah Pike sat beside Clara's bed with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. In his pocket rested a small notebook where he'd written careful words, a proposal that would change both their lives forever. But that conversation would wait until Clara was strong enough to understand what he was offering, and why a man who barely knew her was willing to stake everything on a stranger's worth. The company ledger had recorded Clara's punishment with bureaucratic precision, but it had no columns for measuring courage, no entries for tracking the value of human dignity, and no way to calculate the cost of turning a silent man's heart toward justice. Clara woke to the gentle sound of rain against the clinic windows and the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets against her skin. Pain radiated across her back in waves, but it was the manageable pain of healing, rather than the sharp agony of fresh wounds. Afternoon light filtered through Dr. Martinez's examining room, casting soft shadows that spoke of time past and progress made. "Buenas tardes, senorita," Dr. Martinez said softly, noticing her awakening. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses," Clara replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "How long have I been here?" "2 days. Your back is healing well, but you must move carefully for several weeks." The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. "You have had a visitor." "A very patient visitor." Clara's memory sharpened, bringing back images of gray eyes and gentle hands. "The cowboy, Jonah Pike. See, he has barely left your side. When I insisted he needed rest, he slept in the chair by your bed. When I suggested he might have other responsibilities, he wrote me a note saying that everything else could wait." Dr. Martinez smiled. "I believe he wishes to speak with you when you are ready." Through the window, Clara could see Jonah in the clinic's small garden, grooming one of his horses with methodical care. Even in the simple act of brushing the animal's coat, she could see the patience and gentleness that had marked his care of her. It was something she'd never experienced before, protection offered freely, without expectation or demand for gratitude. "Doctor," she said carefully, "what do you know about him?" "About Jonah Pike?" Dr. Martinez considered his words. "He is a good man, quiet, but not from shyness, careful, but not from fear. He lost his voice some years ago, an arrow to the throat, from what I can determine from examining him. But he communicates quite clearly when he needs to." "He examined him?" "He asked me to yesterday, through written notes. He wanted to ensure he was healthy, free of disease. It struck me as the request of a man making important plans." Before Clara could ask what that meant, a soft knock announced Jonah's arrival. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, waiting for permission to enter. Clara nodded, and he approached her bedside with the same careful gentleness he'd shown the horse. From his pocket, Jonah withdrew a small leather notebook and a pencil. He wrote carefully, then turned the page toward Clara. "How do you feel? Are you in much pain?" His handwriting was neat, practiced, the script of a man who'd learned to make written words carry the weight that others gave to speech. Clara found herself studying his face as he waited for her response. Weather-worn features, gray eyes that missed nothing, and an expression of genuine concern that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. "I'm better," she said aloud. "Thank you." "For everything?" Jonah wrote again. "You have nothing to thank me for. What they did was wrong. Most people would have looked away. I am not most people." He paused, seeming to gather courage, then wrote more. "I would like to ask you something important. When you are stronger." Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. "I'm strong enough now." Jonah took a deep breath, then wrote with careful deliberation. "Clara Reyes, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The words seemed to hang in the air between them like something physical. Clara stared at the page, reading the question again and again, certain she'd misunderstood. When she looked up, Jonah's gray eyes held an expression of hope mixed with resignation, as if he expected refusal, but had needed to ask anyway. You want to marry me? But you barely know me." Jonah wrote quickly. "I know enough. I know you fed hungry children at your own expense. I know you endured punishment rather than betray them. I know you have courage and kindness. What else matters? But why? Why would you want to tie yourself to someone the whole town considers a criminal?" His response came more slowly, each word chosen with care. "Because the whole town is wrong. Because you need protection, I can provide. Because I have been alone too long, and you deserve better than what this place offers." Clara's mind raced through the implications. Marriage to Jonah would change everything: her status in town, her safety, her entire future. But it would also mean binding ourselves to a stranger, however kind, and she'd spent her life valuing independence above all else. I don't need charity, she said carefully. Jonah shook his head emphatically and wrote, not charity, partnership. I need someone who understands kindness. You need someone who will stand with you. We could help each other. And if I said no, then I would respect your decision and ask Dr. Martinez to ensure you have everything needed for recovery. The absence of pressure in his response surprised her. Most men she'd known treated women's choices as temporary obstacles to be overcome through persistence or manipulation. Jonah seemed genuinely prepared to accept her refusal, which somehow made his proposal more compelling rather than less. May I think about it? Of course, Jonah wrote, then added after a moment, but do not take too long. Hayes will be planning his next move. The reminder of Burton Hayes sent a chill through Clara. The company boss would not forget her defiance, and he certainly wouldn't appreciate Jonah's intervention. Her punishment had been designed to break her spirit and warn others against similar actions. If she recovered and resumed her life as if nothing had happened, it would undermine everything Hayes had tried to accomplish. What kind of next move? Jonah's expression darkened as he wrote, men like Hayes do not accept public challenges. He will look for ways to finish what he started, legal ways if possible, other ways if necessary. Clara understood. In a company town, Burton Hayes held power that extended far beyond simple business authority. He could have her evicted, arrested on new charges, or simply make life so difficult that she'd be forced to leave Red Hollow entirely. The families she'd helped would suffer additional punishment for their association with her, but marriage too. Jonah Pike would change her legal status fundamentally. As a married woman, she'd have the protection of her husband's name and rights. More importantly, she'd have the protection of a man who'd proven willing to stand against the company's authority. Your ranch, she said thoughtfully. It's outside town limits? Jonah nodded and wrote, 20 minutes by horse. Far enough for privacy, close enough for business. And you truly want a wife, not just a cause to defend? His response came after a long pause. I want a partner, someone to share the quiet and the storms. I have been alone since losing my voice. You have been alone in different ways. Perhaps we could be less alone together. The simple honesty of his words touched something deep in Clara's chest. She'd spent years maintaining careful independence, accepting help reluctantly, and offering it freely. The idea of genuine partnership, two people choosing to face life's challenges, together held an appeal she'd never allowed herself to consider. If I agreed, she said slowly, what would you expect of me? To be yourself, to speak your mind, to help me understand what I cannot hear. Jonah paused, then added, to trust me to protect you, and to help me be worthy of that trust. Clara closed her eyes, weighing the decision that would reshape her entire existence. When she opened them, Jonah was watching her with patient attention, ready to accept whatever answer she gave. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I will marry you. The transformation in Jonah's expression was subtle but unmistakable relief, joy, and something deeper that looked like gratitude. He wrote quickly, you honor me. I will do everything in my power to be a good husband to you. When? As soon as you are well enough to stand through a ceremony. Judge Whitfield rides circuit through here next week. We could be married then, if you wish. Clara nodded, then winced as the movement pulled at her healing wounds. I should warn you, I have very little to bring to a marriage. My house, my sewing kit, some small savings. Nothing that would make me a profitable wife. Jonah's response came immediately. I have enough for both of us. What I lack is what you have in abundance: connection to community, understanding of others' needs, courage to act on principle. You would make me wealthier in every way that matters. As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, carrying a marriage certificate that looked freshly prepared. "Pardon," he said with barely concealed satisfaction, but I could not help overhearing. "Judge Whitfield is in town today, staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. If you wish, I could arrange for him to perform the ceremony here in the clinic. It would be more private and easier on Clara's injuries." Clara looked at Jonah, who raised his eyebrows. "In question?" The speed of events felt overwhelming, but she understood the wisdom of acting quickly. Every day she remained unmarried was another day for Hayes to devise new troubles. "Today?" she asked. Jonah wrote, "Only if you are certain. Marriage should not be entered lightly." "I'm certain," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Let's not give Mr. Hayes time to create more problems." Dr. Martinez beamed. "Excelente. I will fetch Judge Whitfield and arrange for witnesses. Father Sandoval as well, if you wish religious blessing along with legal ceremony." As the doctor hurried away to make arrangements, Clara found herself alone with the man who would soon be her husband. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled with shared understanding rather than uncertainty. Jonah wrote, "Are you afraid?" Clara considered the question honestly. "Yes, but not of you. Of what comes after." "We will face it together," he wrote. "That is what marriage means." Outside the clinic window, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the glass, washing the dust from Red Hollow's streets and leaving the air clean and full of possibility. In a few hours, Clara Reyes would become Clara Pike, and with that simple change of name, everything would be different. The marriage certificate that would soon bear their signatures represented more than legal documentation. It was a declaration of mutual faith, a promise of protection, and a challenge to anyone who thought that kindness could be whipped out of the world by company justice. Judge Whitfield arrived at the clinic as afternoon shadows began their westward stretch across Red Hollow's dusty streets. He was a compact man in his 60s, with silver whiskers and eyes that had witnessed enough frontier justice to value mercy alongside law. Dr. Martinez had briefed him on the circumstances, and the judge's expression carried both sympathy and determination as he entered Clara's room. "Miss Reyes," he said formally, then corrected himself. "Soon to be Mrs. Pike. I understand you wish to be married today. Under the circumstances, I'm honored to perform the ceremony." Father Sandoval arrived moments later, slightly out of breath from hurrying across town. The young priest carried a small wooden crucifix and a worn Bible, his face bright with the joy of a man who believed firmly in love's power to transform difficult circumstances. "Clara Mihija," he said warmly, "Dr. Martinez tells me you are to be married. This is wonderful news." Jonah had disappeared briefly and returned wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair damp from a quick wash. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band that caught the afternoon light. When Clara looked at him questioningly, he wrote in his notebook, "It was my mother's. If it does not fit, we can have it resized." The ring slipped onto Clara's finger as if it had been made for her, a perfect fit that felt like an omen of good fortune. She twisted it gently, marveling at the weight of gold against her skin and the strange comfort of wearing something that connected her to Jonah's family history. Mrs. Henderson had somehow learned of the wedding and arrived with a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from her garden. "Every bride needs flowers," she declared, pressing the colorful bundle into Clara's hands. The banker's wife had been among those who'd watched Clara's whipping with horrified fascination, but apparently marriage to Jonah Pike had elevated the seamstress to a status worthy of respect. The ceremony itself was brief but dignified. Judge Whitfield spoke of the sanctity of marriage vows and the importance of mutual support in frontier life. Father Sandoval offered prayers in both Spanish and English, blessing the union and asking for God's protection over the new couple. Dr. Martinez and Mrs. Henderson served as witnesses, signing the marriage certificate with careful solemnity. When Judge Whitfield asked if Jonah took Clara as his lawfully wedded wife, Jonah nodded firmly and wrote in his notebook, "I do with all my heart." For Clara's vows, she spoke aloud the traditional words, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. The exchange of rings felt surprisingly intimate, given that they were surrounded by virtual strangers who would become their wedding party. "By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico," Judge Whitfield declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Pike, you may kiss your bride." Jonah approached Clara with the same careful gentleness he'd shown throughout their brief courtship. His kiss was soft, respectful, and somehow managed to convey both promise and patience. When they separated, Clara saw something new in his gray eyes, not just protectiveness, but genuine affection. The small celebration that followed felt surreal. Mrs. Henderson produced a bottle of wine from her husband's private collection. Dr. Martinez offered toasts in both languages. Father Sandoval shared stories of other couples he'd married under unusual circumstances, always managing to find humor and hope in difficult situations. As evening approached, the practical question of where the newlyweds would spend their first night arose. Clara was still recovering from her injuries, and the journey to Jonah's ranch would be uncomfortable in a wagon, potentially dangerous on horseback. "You are welcome to stay here tonight," Dr. Martinez offered. "I have a spare room that would be more comfortable than traveling," Jonah wrote. "Thank you, but Clara should see her new home. I will make the trip as easy as possible." True to his word, Jonah had borrowed a well-sprung buggy from the livery stable, cushioned with blankets and pillows to minimize jarring. The drive to his ranch took 30 minutes through landscape that gradually shifted from town buildings to open desert, punctuated by scrub brush and occasional cottonwoods that marked underground water sources. As they traveled, Clara found herself studying her new husband in the fading light. His hands on the reins were steady and confident, his attention divided between the road ahead and her comfort. When the buggy hit an unavoidable rut, he immediately glanced toward her with concern, ready to stop if the motion caused too much pain. "I'm fine," she assured him, and saw his shoulders relax slightly. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, a modest but well-maintained collection of buildings nestled against a hillside that provided shelter from winter winds. The main house was built of adobe and stone, with a wide front porch that suggested evenings spent watching sunsets. A barn large enough for several horses sat 50 yards away, and Clara could see the shadows of animals moving in the adjoining corral. Jonah helped her down from the buggy with infinite care, then led her toward the house. The front door opened to reveal a surprisingly comfortable interior, wooden floors worn smooth by years of use, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and furniture that was simple but well crafted. Everything was clean and organized, speaking of a man who took pride in his surroundings. "It's lovely," Clara said, and meant it. The house felt like a home rather than just a shelter, filled with the kind of quiet contentment that came from honest work and simple pleasures. Jonah lit several oil lamps, filling the rooms with warm, dancing light. From his pocket, he retrieved his silver pocket watch and checked the time with the careful attention of a man accustomed to managing his own schedule. The watch was clearly old and valuable, its case worn smooth by years of handling. When Clara admired it, Jonah wrote, "My father's watch. He said time heals all wounds." I have found it to be true. The inscription on the watch face bore the same message, engraved in flowing script that spoke of more prosperous times and deeper sentiment than Clara had expected from a simple cowboy. She realized there was much about Jonah Pike that remained mysterious, hidden beneath his quiet exterior and careful mannerisms. "Tell me about your father," she said as they settled into chairs before the fireplace. Jonah wrote slowly, choosing his words with care. He was a good man who died too young. A rancher in Colorado, before the war. He taught me that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who cannot defend themselves. Is that why you helped me? Partly. Also because it was right. Jonah paused, then added, and because something about you reminded me that kindness still exists in the world. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. What happened to your ranch in Colorado? Sold it after father died and mother remarried. Used the money to learn the cattle trade. Spent years on trail drives before. He gestured toward his throat. Before I needed to find a different life. Do you miss it? The trail driving? Jonah considered the question. I miss the freedom of open country, but not the loneliness, and certainly not the constant noise and dust and danger. He smiled slightly. This is better, quieter, more peaceful. Until you married a woman who attracts trouble. You did not attract anything. You simply refused to ignore suffering when you could help. Jonah wrote with firm strokes. That is not trouble. That is character. As the evening progressed, they developed a comfortable rhythm of conversation. Clara spoke aloud, her voice filling the quiet spaces of the house. Jonah responded through written words, his neat handwriting becoming increasingly familiar to her eye. They talked about practical matters, the ranch's operation, Clara's sewing business, their plans for the future, but also about deeper subjects that revealed their shared values and complementary temperaments. When fatigue finally overtook Clara's healing body, Jonah showed her to the bedroom with the same respectful consideration he'd maintained throughout their brief courtship. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed covered in quilts that spoke of long winter nights and careful preparation. I will sleep on the sofa tonight, Jonah wrote, until you are fully healed and ready for other arrangements. Clara felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. Thank you for everything. For today, for your patience, for giving me a chance to start over. Thank you for saying yes, he replied, for trusting a stranger with your future. Alone in the bedroom that was now hers, Clara changed carefully into a nightgown that Dr. Martinez's housekeeper had provided. As she prepared for sleep, she could hear Jonah moving quietly through the house, banking the fire, checking the doors, settling in for the night with the methodical routine of a man accustomed to solitude. The silver pocket watch ticked softly from the dresser where Jonah had left it, its steady rhythm marking the passage of time toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Clara fell asleep to that gentle sound, her hand unconsciously touching the gold wedding band that connected her to a man whose actions spoke louder than any voice. Outside, the desert night wrapped around their small ranch like a protective blanket, filled with the soft sounds of horses moving in the corral and the distant call of coyotes singing to the stars. In Red Hollow, 20 minutes away by wagon, Burton Hayes was probably planning his response to the day's unexpected developments. But here, in this quiet house filled with patient kindness, Clara Pike slept peacefully for the first time in years, protected by more than walls and doors. The pocket watch continued its measured counting of moments, each tick carrying them further from the pain of yesterday and closer to whatever tomorrow might bring. Time, as Jonah's father had believed, was indeed healing, but it was also revealing, gradually unveiling the depth of connection that could grow between two wounded souls who had chosen to face the world together. 3 weeks into their marriage, Clara discovered that her new husband possessed secrets that ran deeper than his quiet exterior suggested. The revelation came on a morning when she woke early and found Jonah already gone from the house, his absence marked only by the lingering scent of coffee and the careful way he'd banked the fire to keep the rooms warm. She found him in the corral, working with a young mare that had been skittish since her arrival. The horse danced nervously at the end of a long rope, white showing around her eyes as she fought against training that seemed harsh to Clara's inexperienced judgment. But as she watched, she began to understand that what looked like struggle was actually an intricate conversation between man and animal. Jonah never raised his voice because he couldn't, never used force because it wasn't in his nature. Instead, he communicated through body language so subtle that Clara had to study his movements carefully to catch the signals he sent. A slight shift in his stance would calm the mare's nervous energy. A gentle pressure on the rope would guide her into the movement he wanted. When the horse responded correctly, his approval was conveyed through relaxed shoulders and a soft touch when she came close enough. Within an hour, the skittish mare was following Jonah around the corral like a devoted dog, nuzzling his shoulder and accepting his touch without fear. Clara realized she was witnessing something remarkable, a man who had learned to communicate with animals through pure understanding, developing skills that most horsemen never achieved, even with full voice and traditional training methods. That was beautiful, she said when Jonah noticed her watching from the fence rail. He wrote in his notebook, she was frightened, not rebellious. Fear requires patience, not force. Where did you learn to work with horses like that? Necessity, he wrote, then added after a pause. And a good teacher who understood that quiet strength often accomplishes more than loud demands. Clara helped him with the morning chores, discovering that ranch work suited her better than she'd expected. Her small hands were perfect for tasks that required delicacy checking eggs for cracks, mending harness leather, treating minor injuries on the animals. Jonah showed her how to approach each task with the same patience he brought to everything else, never rushing, always thinking ahead to prevent problems, rather than simply reacting to them. By afternoon, word had reached the ranch that trouble was brewing in Red Hollow. Young Tommy Martinez arrived on a borrowed horse, his face flushed with excitement and worry in equal measure. Senora Pike, he called as he dismounted, still struggling with Clara's new married name. My uncle sent me to warn you. The company men have been asking questions about you and your husband. Clara felt the familiar chill of fear settle in her stomach. What kind of questions? About where you got money to buy supplies for the families. About whether Senator Pike helped you before you were married. They're saying maybe there was conspiracy from the beginning. Jonah appeared from the barn, alerted by the sound of an unfamiliar horse. Tommy repeated his warning while Jonah listened, with the focused attention of a man accustomed to reading between lines. When the boy finished, Jonah wrote rapidly, What else? Mr. Hayes is telling people that charity undermines the natural order of business. That if workers think someone will always help them, they won't learn to manage their money properly. Tommy's voice carried the confusion of a young man trying to understand adult politics. Some people are starting to believe him. Clara felt anger rise in her chest like heat from a forge. And the families I helped? What do they say? They're scared, Senora. Scared to speak up. Scared to defend you. Mr. Hayes has made it clear that anyone who supports you might find themselves out of work. Jonah wrote, Thank your uncle for the warning. Tell him we appreciate his friendship. After Tommy left, Clara and Jonah sat on their front porch watching the sun settle toward the western mountains. The peace of their ranch felt fragile now, threatened by forces gathering in town like storm clouds on the horizon. They won't leave us alone, will they? Clara said. Jonah wrote, Men like Hayes cannot tolerate examples of independent thinking. Your punishment was supposed to break you. Instead, you found protection and dignity. That threatens everything he believes about power. What do? We continue living our lives with integrity. We help where we can, protect what we must, and prepare for whatever comes next. Clara studied her husband's face, noting the determination that lay beneath his calm exterior. You're not afraid of them. I am afraid of many things, Jonah wrote, but not of men who confuse cruelty with strength. That evening, Clara began to understand the full scope of what she'd married into. As they prepared supper together, she noticed details that spoke of a life more complex than simple ranching. Jonah's boots were of exceptionally fine leather, well maintained, but showing signs of hard use in conditions beyond normal ranch work. His rifle, which she'd glimpsed in passing, was of military quality and bore subtle modifications that suggested someone who understood weapons beyond typical frontier necessities. Most telling was the way he moved through the house, economical, alert, constantly aware of his surroundings in a manner that spoke of training rather than natural caution. Clara had grown up around vaqueros and ranch hands. Jonah's bearing was different, carrying the subtle confidence of a man who had faced danger and survived through skill rather than luck. "Jonah," she said as they sat by the fire after supper, "there's more to your story than cattle driving, isn't there?" He was quiet for a long moment, then wrote, "Everyone has parts of their past they prefer to leave behind. I'm not asking you to relive painful memories. But if we're going to face trouble together, I should know what kind of man I married." Jonah set down his pencil and stared into the fire for several minutes. When he finally wrote again, his words came slowly. "I was a soldier before. I was a cowboy, cavalry. I learned about horses and weapons and fighting from men who understood that survival depends on preparation and teamwork. In the war, after Indian campaigns in Colorado and Wyoming territories. Not proud of all of it, but it taught me skills that have proven useful." Clara felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Is that how you lost your voice? Fighting Indians?" "Fighting men who were defending their homes," Jonah corrected. "The arrow that took my voice also taught me that enemies and friends are often determined by circumstances rather than character." The admission carried weight beyond simple biography. Clara understood that Jonah was revealing not just his history, but his values, a man who had learned to question the righteousness of causes that others accepted without examination. "Do you regret it? The military service?" "I regret some of the things I was ordered to do, but the experience taught me to recognize injustice and stand against it, regardless of who orders otherwise." Jonah paused, then added, "It also taught me that the best battles are won before the fighting starts." Clara reached across to touch his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years working with rope and reins, but also the scars that hinted at harder conflicts. "Thank you for telling me. You have a right to know what you've married into. My past may create problems you never chose." "We all carry our past with us," Clara replied. "The question is what we do with the lessons we've learned." That night, as Clara fell asleep to the familiar ticking of Jonah's pocket watch, she found herself thinking about the document that had formalized their marriage. The certificate represented more than legal recognition. It was proof that two people could choose to combine their separate histories into a shared future. But it was also a challenge to anyone who believed that individual worth could be determined by economic status or social position. Unknown to Clara, hidden in Jonah's trunk beneath work clothes and personal effects, lay a collection of items that told the fuller story of her husband's past. Military commendations written in formal language that praised his exceptional courage under fire and tactical innovation in difficult circumstances. Letters from commanding officers recommending him for assignments that required absolute discretion and proven judgment. Most significantly, a letter from the Secretary of the Army expressing regret over his injury and offering continued employment in advisory capacities suitable to his unique qualifications. Jonah had declined that offer, choosing instead the quiet life of a cattle driver and eventually a small rancher. But the skills and instincts developed through years of military service remained part of him, dormant perhaps, but ready to emerge. When circumstances demanded dot in Red Hollow, Burton Hayes was discovering that his usual methods of intimidation were proving ineffective against Clara Pike's new status. Marriage had provided her with legal protections and social standing that complicated his plans for further punishment. Worse, the story of her whipping and subsequent rescue was spreading beyond Red Hollow, creating exactly the kind of attention that mining companies preferred to avoid Hayes found himself in an uncomfortable position. He needed to reassert his authority without creating martyrs or attracting outside scrutiny. The solution, he decided, lay in targeting the source of Clara's protection rather than Clara herself. Jonah Pike remained an unknown quantity, a man without obvious vulnerabilities who had demonstrated disturbing independence from company-influenced Dot as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, both the Pike Ranch and the Consolidated. Mining company offices buzzed with quiet preparation. Clara and Jonah built their relationship day by day, learning each other's rhythms and discovering the strength that came from genuine partnership. Meanwhile, Burton Hayes gathered information and resources for a confrontation that he was determined to win decisively. The miners' petition that would soon arrive at Clara's door represented both hope and danger, a document signed by dozens of workers demanding fair wages and better conditions. Their names written in careful script, it spoke of courage slowly overcoming fear. It would transform Clara from protected wife back into active advocate, setting in motion events that would test every lesson both she and Jonah had learned about justice, survival, and the price of standing up to power. October brought the first serious frost to Red Hollow, and with it came Elena Morales to Clara's door, carrying her infant son and a folded paper that would change everything. The young mother's face bore the exhaustion of sleepless nights and the desperate determination of someone who had run out of safer options. "Signora Pike," Elena said softly, glancing nervously toward the road as if expecting pursuit. "I need your help, but not for myself, for all of us." Clara welcomed her into the warm kitchen where coffee always waited and questions could be asked without fear of company ears. Elena's baby fussed in her arms, thin and pale, and it spoke of insufficient milk and constant worry. "Tell me," Clara said simply. Elena unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was covered with signatures, dozens of names written in the careful script of men who had learned to write late in life, pressed onto the page with the weight of desperation and hope. "The miners have drafted a petition to the territorial governor. They're demanding investigation of working conditions and fair wages." Clara scanned the document, recognizing many of the names. These were the men whose families she'd helped feed, whose children she'd seen grow thin during the lean months when mine production slowed, but company store prices remained high. Each signature represented not just an individual grievance, but a family's future hanging in the balance. "This is dangerous," Clara said quietly. "Hayes will see this as direct rebellion." "See, we know. That's why they need someone to deliver it who can't be fired from the mines." Elena's eyes carried both hope and apology. "Someone whose husband has independent means and won't be intimidated by company threats." Clara felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The smart choice would be to refuse, to protect the quiet life she and Jonah had built together. But looking at Elena's baby, remembering the hunger she'd seen in many children's faces, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. Where is the petition now? Hidden. The men are afraid to keep it in town. If Hayes finds it before it reaches Santa Fe, they'll be blacklisted or worse, Clara finished. "All right. Bring it here tonight, after dark. We'll find a way to get it to the governor." After Elena left, Clara spent the afternoon in careful thought. When Jonah returned from checking the winter pastures, she showed him the petition and explained the miner's request. His reaction was measured, thoughtful, and ultimately unsurprising. "It's the right thing to do," he wrote after reading through the document. "But Hayes will respond with everything he has. Are you prepared for that? Are you?" Clara countered. Jonah studied her face for a long moment, then walked to a wooden chest in the corner of their bedroom. From beneath carefully folded clothes, he withdrew his rifle, a Winchester that had clearly seen extensive use, but remained in perfect condition. Clara had glimpsed it before, but never examined it closely. Now she could see the modifications. A special sight, subtle alterations to the action that spoke of someone who understood firearms at a professional level. "This is beautiful," she said, surprised by the weapon's obvious quality. Jonah wrote, "It has kept me alive in difficult circumstances. If necessary, it will do the same for us." "You think it will come to violence?" "I think men like Hayes prefer to avoid fair fights. But when cornered, they become dangerous in unpredictable ways." Jonah checked the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "We should be prepared for anything." That evening, 3 miners arrived at the ranch under cover of darkness. Clara recognized Miguel Herrera, whose children she'd fed during his injury recovery, and Jose Valdez, the old man whose wife had blessed Clara's food with tears of gratitude. The third man was younger, with the intense eyes of someone who had appointed himself spokesman for a dangerous cause. "Senora Pike," Miguel said formally, "we are grateful that you will help us. The petition contains truth that must reach the governor's office. What exactly are you asking for?" Jonah wrote, showing the question to the miners. The young man, who introduced himself as Carlos Ruiz, answered with passion barely held in check. "Fair wages for dangerous work. Safety equipment that actually protects. Medical care when men are injured. An end to the company store's monopoly that keeps families in debt forever. Reasonable requests," Clara said. "What makes you think the governor will listen?" "Because we have documented everything," Carlos replied, producing another folder from his jacket. "Accident reports that were never filed. Wage calculations showing how store debts increase, even when families buy only necessities. Testimony from Dr. Martinez about injuries that could have been prevented with proper equipment." Jonah examined the documentation with the thoroughness of someone who understood the importance of evidence. After several minutes, he wrote, "This is thorough and damning. If it reaches the right people, it could force real change." "If it reaches them," Jose said quietly. "Hayes has friends in Santa Fe, powerful friends who benefit from cheap silver and cheap labor." Clara felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the autumn evening. "What kind of friends?" "Politicians who receive campaign contributions, businessmen who buy silver below market prices, territorial officials who have been promised mining investments in their own districts." Carlos's voice carried the bitterness of someone who had learned how deeply corruption could penetrate seemingly legitimate institutions. "All the more reason to make sure this gets to someone who can't be bought," Clara said firmly. Jonah wrote, rapidly, "I know someone, a territorial marshal who served with me in Colorado. Honest man who owes no favors to mining interests." The miners exchanged glances, hope flickering in their expressions. "You could get the petition to him directly?" Miguel asked. "Better. I could arrange for him to come here and investigate personally. But it will take time, and Hayes will try to stop us once he learns what we're doing." "How long?" Carlos asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Long enough for word to leak if we're not careful. Clara understood the implications. 3 weeks of maintaining normal routines while secretly harboring evidence that could destroy Burton Hayes' operation. 3 weeks of watching for company spies, protecting the miners who had signed the petition, and preparing for the inevitable retaliation. "We'll need to be very careful about who we trust," she said. "See," Jose agreed. "There are men in the mines who would sell their mothers for job security." As the miners prepared to leave, Jonah wrote a final message. "Tell your families to be ready for trouble. Keep emergency supplies hidden. Have plans for leaving town quickly if necessary." After the men disappeared into the darkness, Clara and Jonah sat by their fire, discussing the risks they had just accepted. The petition lay on the table between them like a loaded weapon, dangerous to possess, but potentially decisive if used correctly. "Are you afraid?" Clara asked. "Yes," Jonah wrote without hesitation, "but not enough to turn away from what's right. Hayes won't just try to discredit us. He'll try to destroy us completely. Then we'll have to be stronger than he expects, and smarter than he anticipates. Jonah paused, then added, "We'll also have to trust each other completely. No secrets, no hesitation, no doubt about our commitment." Clara reached across to take his hand, feeling the strength in his fingers and the steadiness of his pulse. "No secrets," she agreed, but even as she spoke the words, Clara wondered what other aspects of Jonah's past might emerge under pressure. His military experience was clearly more extensive than he'd revealed, and his connections apparently reached further into territorial politics than a simple ranch hand should possess. She was discovering that her quiet husband carried secrets that might prove either salvation or catastrophe, depending on how skillfully they could navigate the dangerous waters ahead. The Winchester rifle resting against the wall seemed to watch over their conversation, its presence both reassuring and ominous. Clara had never imagined that her acts of simple charity would lead to armed confrontation with powerful interests. But as she looked at the miner's petition with its careful documentation of injustice, she understood that some battles chose you regardless of your preferences. Outside their warm kitchen, the October wind carried the first hints of winter, and with them, the promise that the season ahead would test everything she and Jonah had built together. The petition would reach the territorial marshal, but not before Burton Hayes had time to discover their betrayal and respond with all the ruthless calculation that had made him successful in a business where human life was measured against profit. Margins in town, Hayes was already asking questions about unusual activity at the Pike Ranch, gathering information that would soon crystallize into action. The confrontation that had been building since Clara's whipping was approaching its inevitable climax, and this time there would be no crowd of witnesses to shame the participants into restraint. The discovery came on a gray November morning when Clara was organizing their bedroom, preparing warmer clothes for the approaching winter. Jonah had ridden to town for supplies, leaving her alone with the domestic tasks that had become both routine and comfort in their marriage. As she moved his summer shirts to make room for heavier garments, her hand brushed against something hard in the bottom of his trunk. The object was wrapped in oiled canvas, protected from moisture and time, with the care reserved for precious things. Clara hesitated, respecting her husband's privacy, but curiosity and something deeper a wife's need to understand the man she'd married finally overcame her restraint. Inside the canvas lay a faded photograph, its edges worn from handling, but the image still clear enough to stop Clara's breath. The man in the photograph was unmistakably Jonah, but younger, dressed in the crisp uniform of a United States cavalry officer. More shocking still were the other figures in the image: Mexican civilians, including women and children, standing behind Jonah with expressions of gratitude and respect that spoke of protection rather than conquest. Beneath the photograph lay a collection of documents that painted a picture Clara had never imagined. Military commendations written in formal language praised Lieutenant Jonah Pike for extraordinary heroism in defense of civilian populations and tactical brilliance in preventing massacre of non-combatant families. A letter from his commanding officer described an incident near the village of San Miguel, where Jonah had disobeyed direct orders to allow his troops to pursue hostile Indians through civilian settlements. Instead, according to the official report, Lieutenant Pike had positioned his men to protect the village while negotiating safe passage for Apache raiders who had taken refuge among the Mexican families. The strategy had prevented bloodshed on both sides, but had earned Jonah a formal reprimand for failure to pursue military objectives with appropriate aggression. The final document in the collection was a medical report describing the arrow wound that had ended Jonah's military career. But the circumstances described were nothing like what Clara had imagined. The injury had occurred not during a battle with hostile Indians, but during Jonah's attempt to prevent a revenge attack on the same village he had protected months earlier. He had been shot while placing himself between angry soldiers and innocent civilians, saving lives at the cost of his own voice. Clara sat on their bed, photograph trembling in her hands, understanding finally washing over her like cold water. Her husband's careful compassion, his instinctive protection of the vulnerable, his immediate intervention during her own punishment, all of it made perfect sense now. Jonah Pike was a man who had spent his entire adult life standing between the powerful and the powerless, regardless of the personal cost. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent Clara into a panic of guilt and discovery. She rewrapped the documents, quickly, her mind racing with questions and implications. When Jonah entered the house carrying supplies and wearing his usual expression of quiet contentment, Clara struggled to meet his eyes normally. "How was town?" she asked, hoping her voice sounded natural. Jonah wrote, "Quiet. Hayes was asking questions about our visitors the other night. Word is spreading that something is happening." "What kind of questions? Who visits our ranch? What we discuss?" "Whether we've been corresponding with anyone outside Red Hollow." Jonah's expression darkened. "He's getting desperate, which makes him dangerous." Clara nodded, her thoughts still reeling from her discovery. She wanted to ask about the photograph, about his military service, about the true circumstances of his injury, but something in his manner, a tension she hadn't seen before, suggested that larger concerns were pressing. "Jonah," she said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked up from unpacking supplies, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "I found the photograph. And the military documents. I'm sorry for looking through your things, but I needed to understand." Jonah's hands stilled on the canvas bag he'd been emptying. For a long moment, he stood frozen, then slowly reached for his notebook. When he wrote, his handwriting was less steady than usual. "What did you see?" "Everything. The commendations, the medical report, the truth about how you lost your voice." Clara's words came in a rush. "Why didn't you tell me you were protecting Mexican civilians? That you were court-martialed for refusing to let soldiers attack innocent people?" Jonah sat heavily in the chair across from her, suddenly looking older than his years. He wrote slowly, "Because it's not a story that makes me look heroic. I disobeyed orders, endangered my men, and lost my career because I couldn't follow commands I believed were wrong. You saved lives. I also failed as a soldier. In the Army, following orders matters more than individual conscience." Clara felt anger rising in her chest, not at Jonah, but at a system that punished men for acting with honor. "The families you protected, they were people like my family, weren't they? Mexican settlers trying to build lives in difficult circumstances?" Jonah nodded, then wrote, "San Miguel was much like the village where your grandmother lived." "Good. People caught between forces they couldn't control. And you chose to protect them instead of advancing your career." "I chose to do what seemed right in the moment. The consequences came later." Clara reached across to touch his hand, understanding finally why this quiet man had intervened so decisively during her whipping. "You've been protecting people your entire life." "Not successfully enough," Jonah wrote with bitter honesty. "San Miguel was burned 6 months after I left the Army. My protection was temporary at best, but you tried. When others would have looked away, you tried." Jonah studied her face, searching for judgment or disappointment. Instead, he found something that made his shoulders relax and his expression soften. "You're not angry that I didn't tell you?" "I'm angry that you felt you couldn't tell me. I'm angry that doing the right thing cost you so much." Clara's voice carried the passion of someone who had discovered that her deepest values were shared by the man she'd married. "But I'm not angry at you." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed broke the afternoon quiet. Jonah was on his feet instantly, moving toward the window with the fluid alertness of someone whose reflexes had been honed by years of danger. "Company men," he wrote quickly, showing Clara the words before moving toward his rifle. 6 of them armed. Clara felt her stomach drop. "What do they want?" "Us," Jonah wrote grimly. Hayes has decided to stop being subtle. Through the window, Clara could see Burton Hayes himself leading the group of riders, his face set in lines of cold determination. The men with him were not the usual company enforcers, but harder men professionals who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to violence. "We need to get the petition to safety," Clara said urgently. Jonah was already moving, gathering the miners' documents and wrapping them in oiled cloth. "Hide these in the root cellar," he wrote. "Whatever happens, don't let them find the evidence." As Clara hurried to conceal the petition, she heard Hayes' voice calling from the yard. "Pike, come out here. We need to have a conversation about your recent activities." Jonah checked his rifle one final time, then wrote a last message for Clara. "Stay inside unless I call for you. These men won't hesitate to hurt a woman if they think it serves their purpose." "What are you going to do?" "What I've always done," Jonah wrote, his gray eyes hard as winter steel. "Stand between them and what they want to destroy." Clara watched through the window as her husband stepped onto their front porch, rifle held casually but ready, facing 6 armed men with the same calm courage he'd shown throughout his life. The photograph she'd discovered lay in its hiding place, testimony to a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. But this time, Clara realized with growing dread, there might be no higher authority to appeal to, no command structure to enforce eventual justice. This time, Jonah Pike was entirely on his own, protected only by his own skills and the righteousness of his cause. The confrontation that had been building since Clara's whipping was finally at hand, and the stakes had grown far beyond one woman's dignity to encompass the lives and futures of every working family in Red Hollow Dot in the fading afternoon light. With winter wind beginning to howl through the mountains, the two forces that had been circling each other for months prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of an entire community. The faded photograph of a young cavalry officer protecting Mexican civilians had become prophecy, and Clara Pike found herself watching history repeat itself in the courtyard of her own home. The confrontation in the ranch yard lasted exactly 17 minutes. By Jonah's pocket watch, 17 minutes that would determine everything that followed. Clara counted every second from her position by the window, watching her husband face down 6 armed men with nothing but steady nerves and careful positioning. Burton Hayes sat his horse like a man accustomed to authority, but Clara could see the tension in his posture. He'd brought overwhelming force to what should have been a simple intimidation, which suggested he understood that Jonah Pike was not a simple rancher. "Mr. Pike," Hayes called, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "We have reports of suspicious activity at your ranch, meetings with known agitators, correspondence with outside parties. As a representative of the Consolidated Mining Company and a duly appointed peace officer, I'm conducting an investigation." Jonah stood motionless on the porch, rifle held in, a position that was neither threatening nor submissive. Clara knew he was calculating angles, distances, cover options, the automatic assessments of a man whose survival had once depended on such evaluations. "Nothing to say, Pike?" Hayes continued. "That's all right. We'll just search the premises and see what we find." That was when Jonah moved, stepping forward to the edge of the porch with deliberate purpose. He raised one hand to stop the advancing riders, then reached slowly for the notebook in his shirt pocket. His written message was brief, but Hayes' expression darkened as he read it. "You refuse to allow a lawful search." Hayes' voice rose with theatrical outrage. "That's obstruction of justice, Pike, a crime that carries serious penalties." Clara couldn't see what Jonah wrote in response, but Hayes' face flushed red with anger. "You think your war record protects you here? This isn't Colorado, and I'm not some Apache raider you can buffalo with military tactics." The reference to Jonah's military service sent a chill through Clara. Hayes had been investigating thoroughly, gathering information that could only have come from sources with access to Army records. The confrontation was more planned and dangerous than she'd realized. Jonah wrote another message, this one longer. Hayes read it with growing fury, then crumpled the paper and threw it to the ground. "You're threatening me, Pike?" A washed-up cavalry officer with a damaged throat thinks he can intimidate legitimate business interests? One of Hayes' men leaned over to whisper something urgent in his ear. The company boss listened, nodded grimly, then raised his voice again. "Seems we have company coming up the road. Your friends from town, perhaps? More agitators and troublemakers?" Clara looked toward the road and felt her heart sink. A wagon was approaching, driven by Dr. Martinez, with Father Sandoval beside him. In the back sat several miners' wives, including Elena Morales with her baby. They were arriving at exactly the wrong moment, walking into a confrontation that could turn violent without warning. Jonah must have seen them too, because his stance shifted subtly. Clara recognized the change. He was no longer just protecting his property and his wife, but calculating how to shield multiple innocents from potential harm. The tactical problem had become exponentially more complex. "Well, well," Hayes called with false joviality. "A regular gathering of Red Hollow's finest citizens, all coming to visit the Pikes on the same afternoon. What a coincidence." Dr. Martinez brought his wagon to a stop 50 yards from the house, clearly sensing the tension, but unsure of its exact nature. Father Sandoval climbed down slowly, his youthful face grave with concern. The women in the wagon remained seated, but alert, protective instincts awakened by the sight of armed men surrounding their friend's home. Clara made a decision that would either save lives or endanger them further. She stepped onto the porch beside her husband, ignoring his sharp look of warning. If violence erupted, she wanted to be where she could influence events rather than hiding helplessly inside. "Gentlemen," she called clearly, "is there some problem we can resolve peacefully?" Hayes' attention shifted to her with predatory focus. "Mrs. Pike, how convenient. We were just discussing your husband's recent activities. Perhaps you can shed some light on the visitors you've been entertaining." "We've entertained friends and neighbors, as is customary in civilized society." "Civilized society," Hayes repeated with mock consideration. "Is that what you call conspiracy to undermine legitimate business operations?" Father Sandoval stepped forward, his voice carrying the moral authority of his position. "Senator Hayes, surely there's no need for such a show of force. These are peaceful people. Peaceful people don't harbor agitators and foment rebellion, Father. Your parishioners have been filling innocent ears with dangerous ideas about workers' rights and fair wages. Ideas like justice and dignity for working families?" The priest replied with gentle firmness. "If those concepts threaten your business model, perhaps the model needs examination." Clara saw Hayes' face darken further at the challenge. The company boss was discovering that his usual tactics of intimidation were less effective when applied to people who operated from principle rather than fear. Dr. Martinez joined the conversation with professional calm. "Mr. Hayes, I trust no one has been injured? Your men seem heavily armed for a social visit." "No one has been injured yet," Hayes replied ominously. "But the day is young, and we have serious business to conduct." Jonah wrote rapidly in his notebook, tore out the page, and handed it to Clara. She read it quickly, then looked at him with surprise and growing dread. His message was simple but chilling. Get everyone into the house. This is about to get much worse. "Friends," Clara called to the gathered visitors, "perhaps you should come inside for coffee. The afternoon is getting cold." But it was too late for tactical withdrawals. Even as she spoke, Clara could see more riders approaching from multiple directions, not random travelers, but coordinated forces converging on the ranch with military precision. Hayes had planned this confrontation carefully, bringing enough men to overwhelm any resistance and ensure that whatever happened next would happen on his terms. "I'm afraid your guests will need to wait outside, Mrs. Pike." Hayes said with cold satisfaction. "This is now an official investigation, and I can't have potential evidence tampered with by interested parties." Clara felt the trap closing around them like steel jaws. Hayes had maneuvered them into a position where any resistance would appear to confirm guilt, while submission would allow him to plant or destroy evidence as he chose. Worse, the presence of innocent civilians limited their options while increasing the potential consequences of any mistake. Jonah's military training was evident in how he repositioned himself to maintain sightlines on all approaching threats, while keeping Clara and the visitors in protected positions. But Clara could see the calculation in his movements, the grim arithmetic of a man who understood that the odds were shifting decisively against them. In her pocket, Clara's fingers found the silver locket that had belonged to her mother, a small comfort in the gathering storm. The locket contained a prayer for protection written in her grandmother's careful Spanish, words that had traveled from Mexico to New Mexico, carrying the hopes of women who had faced similar moments of crisis with nothing but faith and determination. As the circle of armed men tightened around the ranch and Hayes prepared to make his next move, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. She stepped forward, placing herself between the company boss and her husband, and spoke with the clear voice of someone who had found courage in the most unlikely places. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her words carrying across the yard with unexpected authority, "before you proceed with whatever you're planning, I think you should know that everything you've done here today has been witnessed by representatives of the church, the medical profession, and the working families of Red Hollow. Whatever happens next will be remembered and reported accurately." Hayes' expression shifted from confident aggression to uncertain calculation. He'd planned to conduct his business away from prying eyes, but Clara had just reminded him that his actions were creating witnesses whose testimony could travel far beyond his immediate control. The silver locket grew warm in Clara's hand as she waited for Hayes' response, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just their own fate, but the future of everyone who had dared to believe that justice might be possible in a company town. Behind her, she could feel Jonah's solid presence and the weight of his gray eyes as he prepared for whatever battle was coming. The wind carried the scent of approaching snow and the sound of more horses arriving as Red Hollow's two opposing forces prepared for a confrontation that would echo through the territory's history books if anyone survived to write them. The moment that changed everything came when Elena Morale's baby began to cry. The sound cut through the tense silence like a blade, innocent and heartbreaking in its vulnerability. One of Hayes' hired gunmen, already nervous from the standoff, spun toward the wagon with his pistol half drawn before catching himself. "Easy," Dr. Martinez said quietly, raising his hands slowly. "Just a frightened child." But the damage was done. The near drawing of a weapon had shifted the confrontation from intimidation to genuine threat. Clara saw Jonah's stance change subtly, his body coiling like a spring prepared to release devastating force. The careful balance they'd all been maintaining was crumbling. "Enough theater," Hayes declared, his patience finally exhausted. "Pike, you're going to invite us inside for a thorough search of your property. Refuse, and I'll arrest everyone here for conspiracy and harboring fugitives." Clara felt the silver locket pulse warm against her palm as she made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of stepping back or seeking shelter, she moved forward, placing herself directly between Hayes and the ranch house. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a clarity that surprised even her, "I believe you're looking for this." From her coat, she withdrew a folded paper, not the real miner's petition, which remained safely hidden, but a decoy she'd prepared weeks earlier. A list of grievances written in her own hand, containing enough truth to be credible, but lacking the signatures and detailed evidence that could destroy individual families. Hayes eyes fixed on the document with predatory hunger. What is that? What you came for? A petition to the territorial government requesting investigation of working conditions in Red Hollow. I wrote it myself, based on conversations with concerned families. Hand it over. Clara held the paper steady, though her heart was racing. First, I want your word that the families who spoke to me will face no retaliation. Hayes laughed harshly. You're hardly in a position to negotiate terms, Mrs. Pike. Actually, I think I am. Clara's voice grew stronger as she found her footing in this deadly game. That petition contains specific allegations about safety violations and illegal wage practices. If it disappears, Dr. Martinez and Father Sandoval have copies. If something happens to them, additional copies are already in the hands of territorial authorities. It was a complete bluff, but Clara delivered it with the conviction of absolute truth. She could see uncertainty flicker across Hayes' face as he calculated the implications of her claim. Behind her, Clara heard Jonah shift position, and she knew without looking that he was preparing to support whatever strategy she was attempting. The knowledge gave her strength to continue. What I'm proposing, she said clearly, is an exchange. You take the petition and leave these people alone. In return, I'll come with you to answer questions about its contents. Clara, no, Dr. Martinez called urgently. But Hayes was already considering the offer, recognizing it as a face-saving compromise that would give him what he needed while avoiding the complications of a larger confrontation. A single woman could be discredited or silenced far more easily than an entire community of witnesses. Acceptable, he said finally. The petition and yourself. Everyone else goes home and forgets this visit ever happened. Not acceptable, Jonah wrote rapidly, showing the message to Hayes. The company boss read it, his expression darkening. Your husband seems to have objections, Hayes observed. Perhaps he doesn't trust my intentions regarding your welfare. Clara turned to look at Jonah, seeing the conflict in his gray eyes. He understood the tactical necessity of her gambit, but every instinct honed by years of protecting the innocent was screaming against allowing her to sacrifice herself. It's the right choice, she said softly, speaking to him alone. You know, it is. Jonah wrote again, his handwriting sharp with emotion. I won't let them take you. You won't be letting them do anything. I'm choosing this. Clara reached up to touch his face gently. Sometimes the best way to protect everyone is to draw the fire onto yourself. Before Jonah could respond, Clara pulled the silver locket from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. Keep this safe for me. And remember what your father's watch says: time heals all wounds. Hayes was growing impatient with their private conference. Enough sentiment. Mrs. Pike, you'll come with us now, or the deal is off. Clara straightened her shoulders and walked toward Hayes' horse, the folded petition held visible in her hand. Each step felt like a small victory over fear, though she could feel the weight of everyone's stares and the almost physical pull of Jonah's desperate concern. The petition first, Hayes demanded, extending his hand. Clara hesitated, then handed over the document that represented months of careful preparation and her last bargaining chip. Hayes scanned it quickly, his expression shifting from satisfaction to puzzlement to growing anger. This is incomplete, he said sharply. Where are the signatures? The supporting documentation? There aren't any, Clara replied with perfect honesty. I told you I wrote it myself, based on conversations. If you want formal accusations with evidence, you'll need to conduct your own investigation. Hayes' face darkened as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. The petition was real, but largely useless, a list of general complaints without the specific evidence needed to identify and punish individual troublemakers. You're playing games with me, Mrs. Pike. I'm giving you exactly what I promised. A petition requesting territorial investigation of working conditions. If that's not what you expected, perhaps you should have been more specific in your demands. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted Hayes' response. But these weren't more company men. Clara recognized the steady pace and purposeful approach of someone arriving on official business. A single rider crested the hill, wearing the distinctive badge and bearing of a territorial marshal. Hayes spun in his saddle, his face going pale as he recognized the newcomer. "Marshal Rodriguez, what brings you to Red Hollow?" The marshal was a weathered man in his 50s, with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in frontier conditions. His eyes swept the scene-armed company men, frightened, civilians, and a standoff that reeked of potential violence. "Received a telegram requesting investigation of labor disputes and possible civil rights violations," Rodriguez said evenly. "Seems I arrived at an interesting moment." Clara felt relief flood through her like cool water. Jonah's military connections had come through exactly as promised, though the timing was almost impossibly fortunate. "Marshal," Hayes said with forced cordiality, "this is simply a private business matter, nothing that requires territorial intervention." "Funny thing about that," Rodriguez replied, dismounting with deliberate care. "The telegram came from some very specific sources, with some very serious allegations. Thought I'd better investigate personally." Clara caught Jonah's eye and saw something she'd never seen before, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Somehow, impossibly, he'd managed to call in help at exactly the right moment. Hayes was clearly calculating his rapidly diminishing options. The arrival of territorial authority had transformed the situation from private intimidation to public accountability. Whatever he'd planned to do with Clara would now have to be conducted under official scrutiny. "Of course, Marshal," Hayes said through gritted teeth. "We'll cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation." "Excellent," Rodriguez replied. "Let's start with why you brought 6 armed men to visit a ranch family." "In my experience, social calls don't usually require quite so much firepower." Marshal Rodriguez's presence transformed the confrontation from private intimidation to public accountability. But Burton Hayes was too desperate and too deeply committed to retreat gracefully. Clara watched the company boss's face cycle through emotion, surprise, calculation, and finally a cold determination that spoke of a man who had decided to risk everything on one final gambit. "Marshal Rodriguez," Hayes said with forced composure, "your timing is fortunate. I was just about to arrest Mrs. Pike here for theft, conspiracy, and inciting rebellion among company workers." The marshal's weathered face remained impassive. "Those are serious charges. What evidence supports them?" Hayes gestured toward Clara with theatrical certainty. "She's admitted to organizing petition drives against the company. She's been meeting secretly with known agitators and financing illegal activities with stolen funds." "I see." Rodriguez's tone was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Pike, how do you respond to these allegations?" Clara felt the weight of everyone's attention, but also the strength that came from knowing she stood on solid ground. "Marshal, I've never stolen anything. I used my own money to help hungry families buy food. If that's a crime, then basic Christian charity has become illegal in New Mexico." "Territory. And the petition?" Clara held up the document Hayes had returned to her. "Written by me, based on legitimate concerns about working conditions. If expressing opinions about worker safety constitutes rebellion, then the Constitution means less than I thought." Rodriguez examined the petition briefly, his expression revealing nothing. "Mr. Hayes, this appears to be exactly what Mrs. Pike described. A citizen's complaint about working conditions. Where's the evidence of theft or conspiracy?" Hayes' confidence was beginning to crack, but he pressed forward with increasing desperation. "She's been meeting with miners who signed a more detailed petition, one that contains specific accusations and demands for territorial intervention. She's hiding evidence of organized rebellion. Is that true, Mrs. Pike?" Clara looked directly into the marshal's eyes. "I've spoken with many families about their concerns. If their willingness to discuss problems makes them rebels, then every conversation in Red Hollow would be treasonous. It was then that Jonah stepped forward, producing his notebook and writing rapidly. He tore out the page and handed it to Rodriguez, who read it with growing interest. "What does it say?" Hayes demanded. Rodriguez looked up from the note with an expression that had shifted subtly toward suspicion, not of Clara, but of Hayes himself. "Mr. Pike has made some interesting observations about your investigation methods. He suggests that your interest in his wife might be motivated more by revenge than by legitimate law enforcement. That's ridiculous. I'm conducting official business on behalf of the Consolidated Mining Company." "About that," Rodriguez said thoughtfully, "I've been reviewing company records as part of my investigation. Found some interesting discrepancies in your financial reports to Denver headquarters." Hayes' face went white. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind that suggests someone has been skimming profits and blaming shortfalls on worker theft and inefficiency." Rodriguez's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades distinguishing truth from lies. "The kind that might motivate a desperate man to create scapegoats for his own crimes." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Clara saw Hayes' hired men exchanging glances, their loyalty suddenly questionable when their employer's integrity was in doubt. Dr. Martinez and Father Sandoval moved closer to the marshal, sensing that the balance of power was shifting decisively. "Those records are confidential company business," Hayes blustered. "You have no authority to." "Actually, I have territorial authority to investigate any criminal activity, including embezzlement and fraud." Rodriguez's tone remained level, but steel showed beneath the courtesy. "And when a company boss uses armed men to intimidate citizens who might have evidence of his crimes, that becomes my business immediately." Clara felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Hayes' desperate pursuit of the miners' petition wasn't just about controlling worker unrest. It was about preventing the discovery of his own financial crimes. The missing inventory, the mysterious fees and charges, the families kept in perpetual debt despite working full-time all it had made. Since as part of a systematic theft operation disguised as aggressive business management. Jonah wrote another note and handed it to Rodriguez, who read it with grim satisfaction. "Mr. Pike points out that your store's inventory records would be very interesting reading. He suggests that a comparison between what you've reported to company headquarters and what you've actually sold might reveal some creative accounting." Hayes was trapped, and he knew it. But cornered men were dangerous, especially when they had nothing left to lose. Clara saw him glance toward his hired guns, calculating whether violence might still salvage something from the wreckage of his schemes. "Marshal," Clara said urgently, "there's something else you should know." Before Hayes could stop her, Clara produced the real miner's petition from where she'd hidden it beneath her coat. The document that contained dozens of signatures and detailed evidence of safety violations and wage theft, evidence that would corroborate everything Rodriguez had just suggested about Hayes' criminal activities. "You interfering." Hayes started forward, his hand moving toward his gun. But Jonah was already in motion. Years of military training condensed into fluid action that put him between Hayes and Clara before the company boss could complete his draw. The Winchester rifle appeared in Jonah's hands with practiced ease, its barrel centering on Hayes' chest with unwavering steadiness. The standoff lasted perhaps 3 seconds, time enough for everyone to understand how quickly the situation had escalated, how close they'd come to bloodshed, and how thoroughly Hayes' position had collapsed. "Easy, everyone," Rodriguez said with professional calm. "Mr. Hayes, I suggest you remove your hand from your weapon very slowly." Hayes complied, his face twisted with rage and defeat. Around him, his hired men were carefully not reaching for their own guns, recognizing that their employer's cause was lost and their own survival depended on avoiding violence with a territorial marshal present. "Mrs. Pike," Rodriguez continued, I'll take custody of that petition. It'll serve as evidence in what I suspect will be a very thorough investigation of company practices." As Clara handed over the document, she felt the silver locket warm in Jonah's hand where he'd returned it to her. The prayer her grandmother had written, a plea for protection and justice, seemed to have been answered in ways she could never have imagined. Dot from across the yard. She heard the sound that would ring in her memory forever, the clear, bright toll of the church bell in Red Hollow, ringing out across the desert afternoon. Father Sandoval had slipped away during the confrontation, and somehow arranged for the bell to announce that the confrontation was over, that justice had prevailed, and that the town was finally free from Burton Hayes' tyranny. Dot, as the bell continued its celebration, Clara saw something she'd never expected to witness. Jonah Pike opening his mouth and speaking aloud for the first time since she'd known him. "Thank you, Marshal," he said, his voice rusty from disuse, but clear and strong. "Thank you for arriving when you did." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who had found his voice again in the moment when justice finally prevailed. Clara reached for his hand, feeling the strength in his fingers and the steady beat of his pulse as Red Hollow's church bell continued to ring out the news that tyranny's hold on their community had finally been broken. 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of what had once been the company store, watching her husband arrange merchandise on shelves that bore fresh paint and honest prices. The hand-painted sign above the entrance read, "Pike and Reyes General Store," in letters that caught the morning sunlight like captured hope. The transformation of Red Hollow had been swift once Marshal Rodriguez's investigation uncovered the full extent of Burton Hayes' embezzlement and fraud. The Consolidated Mining Company, faced with evidence of systematic theft and worker abuse, had negotiated a settlement rather than risk a territorial scandal. Hayes himself was serving 5 years in the territorial prison, his schemes finally catching up with him in a courtroom where intimidation carried no weight. "The new coffee arrived yesterday," Jonah said, his voice still carrying the wonder of someone rediscovering speech after years of silence. "Mrs. Henderson says it's the best she's tasted since moving here from Denver." Clara smiled, watching him work with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The return of his voice had been gradual, beginning with single words spoken in moments of strong emotion and slowly expanding into full conversation. Dr. Martinez believed the psychological trauma of his original injury had prolonged the physical effects, and that healing his spirit had finally allowed his throat to function normally. "Any word from Miguel about the safety committee?" Clara asked. "They approved new regulations for the deep shafts and ordered proper ventilation equipment from Chicago. The miners voted to name you as their official representative to the Territorial Labor Commission." Clara touched her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement that spoke of new life taking shape. "I'm not sure how effective I'll be once the baby arrives. I suspect you'll find a way to manage both responsibilities," Jonah replied with a slight smile that had become more frequent as their marriage deepened. "You've never been one to back down from important work." The baby was due in late spring, and Clara had spent the winter months preparing for motherhood while helping to establish the new economic structure that would replace the company's stranglehold on Red Hollow. The store they now operated sold goods at fair prices, extended credit based on ability to pay rather than company loyalty, and served as an informal community center where people could gather to discuss concerns without fear of retaliation. Father Sandoval appeared in the doorway, carrying a letter that bore official territorial seals. "This came with the morning mail," he said, his young face bright with curiosity. "Looks important." Clara opened the letter carefully, her eyes widening as she read the formal language within. "It's from the territorial capital," she said slowly. "They're inviting us to testify before a commission investigating labor conditions throughout New Mexico." "Both of us?" Jonah asked. "The letter specifically mentions Mr. and Mrs. Jonah Pike, whose courage in exposing corporate abuse has become a model for citizen action throughout the territory. Clara looked up from the page with wonder. They want to use our story to develop new protections for working families. Father Sandoval beamed with pride. You've become famous, whether you intended to or not. Famous or not, Clara replied, we'll go if it helps other communities facing similar problems. Through the store's front window, Clara could see the changes that had transformed Red Hollow over the past months. Where company enforcers had once patrolled with weapons, children now played safely in the streets. Where families had once struggled to afford basic necessities, small businesses were opening to serve community needs. Where fear had once silenced legitimate complaints, people spoke openly about their hopes and concerns for the future. The most visible symbol of change was the old whipping post, which had been removed from the town square and replaced with a small garden tended by the miners' wives. Clara sometimes walked past the spot where she'd endured her punishment, marveling at how completely the landscape of power had shifted. Dr. Martinez entered the store carrying his medical bag and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd just delivered good news to a patient. The Herrera baby is thriving, he announced. Proper nutrition makes all the difference. And the father's injury? Clara asked. Healing well. The new safety regulations prevented what could have been much more serious accident. Dr. Martinez accepted a cup of coffee from Jonah and settled into one of the chairs they'd placed near the store's front window. I've been thinking about your testimony to the Territorial Commission. You should mention how the health of the entire community improved once families could afford adequate food and medical care. Will you come with us to Santa Fe? Jonah asked. Your medical documentation was crucial to the marshal's investigation. I'd be honored. This work you've begun here, it's exactly what territorial authorities need to understand about the connection between economic justice and public health. As the afternoon progressed, a steady stream of customers and friends flowed through the store. Elena Morales brought her baby, now healthy and robust, to show off his latest achievements. Miguel Herrera discussed plans for expanding the miners' cooperative. Mrs. Henderson, who had become one of Clara's most ardent supporters, brought fresh bread and gossip from the boarding house. Each visitor carried stories of gradual but meaningful change. Children were attending school regularly instead of working to supplement family income. Families were paying down debts that had seemed insurmountable under the company system. Most importantly, people were planning for the future with hope, rather than simply surviving from paycheck to paycheck. As evening approached and the last customers departed, Clara and Jonah sat together on the front porch of the store, watching. The sun settled toward the western mountains. The ritual had become precious to them. A quiet time to reflect on the day's accomplishments and plan for tomorrow's challenges. Do you ever miss the quiet life we had before all this began? Clara asked. Jonah considered the question seriously before answering. I miss the simplicity sometimes, but not the isolation, and certainly not the feeling that injustice was happening around us while we did nothing to stop it. Even knowing what it would cost us, the danger, the uncertainty, the responsibility we carry now, especially knowing. The cost, Jonah replied. The things worth having are usually worth fighting for. Clara reached for his hand, feeling the wedding ring that had become warm and familiar on her finger. I'm grateful for all of it. For your courage, for the friends we've made, for the chance to build something better. And for the baby, especially for the baby. A child born into a community where people take care of each other, where justice means something, where the future holds promise instead of just more of the same. As darkness settled over Red Hollow, lights began appearing in windows throughout the town. Not the harsh glare of company searchlights watching for troublemakers, but the warm glow of families gathering for evening meals and quiet conversation. The change was subtle but profound. The difference between a place where people lived under surveillance and a place where they lived with dignity. Jonah pulled out his father's pocket watch, checking the time with the habitual gesture that had become endearing to Clara. "Time to close up and head home," he said. "Time heals all wounds," Clara quoted, remembering the inscription that had given them both comfort during the darkest moments of their struggle. "And time reveals what's truly valuable," Jonah added, standing to help Clara to her feet with the extra care that her pregnancy required. As they locked the store and prepared for the short ride to their ranch, Clara looked back at the building that had once represented economic oppression, but now stood as a symbol of community cooperation. The hand-painted sign caught the last rays of sunlight, its cheerful message promising fair dealing and honest service to anyone who entered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, testimony to prepare for the Territorial Commission, decisions about expanding their business, the ongoing work of building a more just community. But tonight, Clara Pike was content to ride home beside her husband, feeling their unborn child moving beneath her heart, and knowing that they had proven something important about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. Silver locket rested warm against her skin, its prayer for protection and justice finally answered in ways her grandmother could never have imagined. And in the distance, Red Hollow's church bell rang the hour, its clear voice carrying across the desert night like a promise that some victories, once won, echo through generations of memory and hope. The story that had begun with a whipping post and a silent cowboy's intervention had become something larger, a testament to the truth that love and courage, properly applied, could transform not just individual lives but entire communities. And as the stars emerged over New Mexico territory, Clara and Jonah Pike rode toward their future with the quiet satisfaction of people who had discovered that the most powerful revolutions begin not with violence, but with two hearts willing to stand together against injustice.